What was the Human Genome Project?
It's basically the entire instruction book for an organism.
Was it harder to discover the human genome or be appointed by two different presidents?
Both of those had certain challenges.
How much longer do you think people really can keep increasing their longevity?
We might figure out how to achieve that by tinkering a bit with the biology.
What is the single greatest health challenge the United States faces today?
More people died of opioid overdoses than of car wrecks last year. It's just unbelievable.
Would you fix your tie, please?
Well, people wouldn't recognize me if my tie was fixed, but okay. Just leave it this way. All right. I don't consider myself a journalist, and nobody else would consider myself a journalist. I began to take on the life of being an interviewer, even though I have a day job of running a private equity firm. How do you define leadership? What is it that makes somebody tick? Dr. Collins, thank you very much for taking time with us today. You are the 16th director of the NIH. You're the only person who was appointed by two different presidents. You were initially appointed by President Obama and then subsequently by President Trump. So as a person who co-discovered the human genome, was it harder to discover the human genome or be appointed by two different presidents?
I guess both of those had certain challenges associated. I did not expect to still be in this position after January of 2017 because I knew about the history too. And NIH directors appointed by the president virtually always have turned over when there's a new president. Somehow they made a mistake here, I guess, and kept me on.
So did President Trump call you up and said he knew you'd done a great job, or how did that come about?
I got a call saying, we want you to come to New York and meet with Trump in Trump Tower a few days before the inauguration so that he can talk to you and interview you and get a sense of whether you're somebody that he might want to keep on. So I went.
Okay, so you went to Trump Tower?
I did.
Now, you seem to be a man of simple taste, so I suspect you were not a big shopper in Trump Tower stores before?
I had not been there before. You're quite right. I rode the bus from Washington to New York for my interview. I suspect I may have been the only person who rode the bus to an interview in Trump Tower, but there you go.
I'm sure that's true. So how was the interview?
I had less than half an hour with the president-elect for him to ask me a few questions and a few other people in the room also. So I wasn't at all sure how it had gone, but you know, I showed up. I did the best I could to answer those questions and waited to see what would happen.
Okay, so to the country's relief, I think you have the job. So you mentioned your family. You were raised on a farm, more or less, is that right?
I was.
And you were homeschooled.
Homeschooled, not because my parents were religious in their persuasion at all, but because they thought the county schools where I grew up in the Shenandoah Valley, Virginia, were not up to my parents' standards. My mother was incredibly gifted as a teacher, and she figured out early on how to get the process of learning to be something wonderfully exciting. And that's the gift she gave me and my brothers, this excitement about learning new things, which I carry with me to this day.
You did this until the 6th grade.
Yeah.
And then you went to school.
I think my mom was a little tired of teaching all of these 4 boys at that point and figured, okay, the public schools in the city of Stanton are maybe up to better standards. So I started going to public school.
You were a musician as well. You have a band, or you had a band. How did you come to that?
So my dad was trained as a classical violinist, but he and my mom, who met at Yale, she was getting her master's degree, he has his PhD. They went and worked for Eleanor Roosevelt in the depths of the Depression in West Virginia, trying to help coal miners get back on their feet. And my dad fell in love with the traditional music that the coal miners would play, particularly on the fiddle. We didn't have a television, so what did you do after dinner at the farm? Either my dad would read Charles Dickens out loud, or we would get out instruments and play. And if you wanted to be in this family, you better learn how to play something.
So did famous musicians come over your house?
People would drop by. Perhaps the best known, although not at the time, was a particularly sullen 18-year-old who showed up sort of being brought along by a more senior, experienced folk song writer and singer. And the young 18-year-old turned out was having his birthday in our living room. And he sang a few songs, had a terrible voice, had no social skills, and I was quite sure he had no future at all. That, of course, turned out to be Bob Dylan.
Did you ever meet him again?
I did.
Did he remember you?
No, he denies the whole thing. It was quite a bit later, like maybe 10 years ago.
You went to college at University of Virginia?
Yep.
And Were you an academic superstar there?
I was a bit of a nerd. I got excited about science in high school. I should give testimony right now to the importance of having really good teachers in high school. What got me interested in science didn't come from my family. No scientists, no physicians for generations around.
Okay.
It was that course I had from John House in 10th grade at Lee High School in Stanton, Virginia.
So you then went to Yale to get a PhD in what?
In chemical physics, so it was very
What is chemical physics?
quantum mechanics.
Okay.
It was mathematical, physical science.
Okay, so your parents are obviously proud. You get a degree at University of Virginia, you have a PhD from Yale, and now you're ready to get a job, right?
You would think so, wouldn't you?
Well, what happened?
Here I was as a graduate student, sort of working late at night at 2 in the morning, and there's another guy of one floor above me who was also there in the middle of the night, and he was working in a lab on DNA. And the more I read about it and talked to him about it and began to read articles about it, the more excited I got about this is an area of science that is ready to burst forward with all kinds of potential. And frankly, I was feeling a little bit lonely and a little bit like what I was pursuing in terms of quantum mechanics and second order differential equations that nobody could solve. Maybe that wasn't going to be my way of making the world a really much better place, and maybe there was something else I could do.
So you got your medical degree.
As a medical student, I was trying to figure out how do I put this all together? My appreciation, my love for digital information, for mathematics, which is what I got out of chemistry and physics, with this messy thing called medicine. Well, where does it all come together? In genetics. DNA is digital information. It's something you can compute on.
Okay.
And it also is fundamental to life, and it's fundamental to medicine. So by the time I was halfway through my first year as a medical student, I knew I wanted to be a geneticist.
Let me talk a little bit about something that you did that brought you to national fame and attention, and that's the Human Genome Project. What was the Human Genome Project, and why do we care about your having co-discovered it?
Well, good question. So what is the genome anyway? It's basically the entire instruction book, which is written in the language of DNA for an organism. So we humans have a genome, so do all other living organisms, animals, plants, bacteria, they all have a genome. Ours is pretty big. If you think of DNA as a language, it's an interesting one. It has just 4 letters in its alphabet, which we call A, C, G, and T because they're abbreviations for chemical bases. And our genomes are 6 billion of those letters. You get 3 billion from mom and 3 billion from dad. That's a lot, although it's pretty amazing to contemplate that that's a bounded set of information, and that seems to be sufficient to build a human being from a single cell. And when the Genome Project was started in 1990, we knew very little of that information. We had little snippets here and there of DNA information, but the whole thing loomed in front of us almost like an impossible task because our technology was nowhere near up to the ability to read that number of letters in any kind of measurable time.
So why is a person watching this or any human being better off because we now have mapped the human genome?
Well, there were many questions about that. The whole thing got finished in 2003, and there were some silly comments about, okay, medicine will be transformed in the next 2 weeks because of this. Of course not. 6 billion letters that you don't really know the language, it's going to take a while to figure it out. What's happened now over those last 14 years since then has, however, been transformative in medicine and particularly in cancer. Cancer now, if you develop that terrible disease, you want to know exactly what misspellings have happened in the genome of those cancer cells that are causing those good cells to go bad. And that is a transforming capability that's now affordable because of the Genome Project and pretty much has changed everything in terms of the way in which we approach the diagnosis and treatment of cancer.
Today, I think it's the case you can have, anybody can have their human genome mapped for, is it $1,000 or less?
It's even a little less now, yeah.
And have you had yours?
You know, I have not had the whole thing read out, but I had a sampling of it, 8 years ago. I was writing a book about personalized medicine, and I wanted to use myself as a guinea pig. And so, yeah, I learned some things in that process of doing that about my own future risks that I found useful. One thing I did learn was that my risk of diabetes was substantially higher than the average person based on my genetic inheritance, and that was sort of a shock because that's not something that's run in my family. But my family are all pretty lean, athletic people, so maybe they managed to avoid it. That was at a point where I was not lean and athletic. I was kind of indulging in too many muffins and honey buns and not doing any exercise, and I was getting chunky. And that was enough to motivate me 8 years ago to change all of that, to lose 35 pounds, to get an exercise program. I'm a different person now than I would have been if I'd stayed on that
Really?
same path.
Well, muffins and honey buns are not healthy for you, is what you're saying?
They are not healthy for
Okay.
anybody, I'm afraid.
How much longer do you think people really can keep increasing their longevity?
If you look sort of around 1900, average lifespan in the United States was only your late 40s. So we've dramatically extended that. Is human life extendable beyond about age 100? It's not clear that if we don't tinker with biology, that we'll get much beyond that point, because there does seem to be sort of a program here of limited lifespan. And frankly, evolution cares about that. You've got to get one generation out of the way so the next one has its chance.
Dr. Collins, in addition to being the director of the NIH, you also maintain your own lab at the NIH. So your lab is in genetic research?
Particularly focused on diabetes and, interestingly enough, also on aging.
What am I looking at now?
Well, this machine basically analyzes DNA. And particularly, it looks at places where there's differences in your DNA and mine, variation, because that's pretty interesting stuff if you're trying to understand risks for something like diabetes. You see that flashing light? That spot there has DNA in it from a person, and the flash is a laser, and it basically blasts the DNA into the gas phase.
Right.
And then it travels down a long tube in this mass spectrometer, and it is measured by its molecular weight, which can tell you what was the actual DNA sequence.
Give me one or two examples, if you could, of something where you funded it and it became, you or your predecessors funded, and it became very helpful to the health of individuals.
Sure, and there's a long, long list of examples. Let's just take what's happened with heart disease. Heart disease death rates from heart attack are down by more than 70%. Why is that? Part of that is our funding something called the Framingham study in Massachusetts, which taught us what the risk factors are that you could actually interfere with. We didn't really know how important hypertension was and how critical it was to treat it until that came along. Part of this is also drugs. Statins, the most commonly prescribed drug these days. Why do we know about statins? It's because of basic science research done 30 years ago by Nobel laureates Brown and Goldstein, figuring out that there was a critical pathway that controlled cholesterol and that you could interfere with that by the development of a particular drug.
When humans first emerged from caves 200,000 years ago or so, or Homo sapiens emerged, the average life expectancy was 20, more or less. Mm-hmm. Today, it's more or less in developed world, the United States, maybe 80, around 80. Mm-hmm. So we've increased our life expectancy by roughly 4 times. How much longer do you think people really can keep increasing their longevity?
So much of that just happened in the last 100 years. If you look sort of around 1900, average lifespan in the United States was only your late 40s. So we've dramatically extended that. Is human life extendable beyond about age 100? It's not clear that if we don't tinker with biology, that we'll get much beyond that point, because there does seem to be sort of a program here of limited lifespan. And frankly, evolution cares about that. You've got to get one generation out of the way so the next one has its chance. But we're getting pretty smart about understanding what are the actual molecular steps in aging, and maybe, if we think it's a good idea, we might figure out how to achieve that kind of extension by tinkering a bit with the biology.
On heart disease, do you think it's possible to eliminate all heart problems completely by diet, exercise, and statins?
Heart disease has a strong genetic component. If you're somebody in a family where heart disease has happened, that's something that probably could apply to you. Cholesterol is certainly a big risk factor. If your cholesterol is in that range, up above 200, and increasingly we're saying maybe even below that, reducing it clearly reduces the likelihood of a heart attack, and so it's worth doing. So more and more people are getting this recommendation about statins. It's particularly important for somebody who's had a heart attack and doesn't want to have another one to get on a statin and to really manage their cholesterol very tightly. That clearly is one of the reasons why people are living longer.
So what do you think is the single greatest health challenge the United States faces today?
You know, right now it is the opioid crisis. I'm spending a huge amount of my time working with the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, Nora Volkoff, on this, and we've been to the White House several times and have a very strong effort underway now to work with the private sector to develop and implement quickly non-addictive painkillers, because opioids are pretty effective for treating pain. We need something else, but something that isn't going to kill people. We can speed that up, especially with help from the FDA. And that is, I think, if you just look at what's the current public health crisis around us, that's number one. More people died of opioid overdoses than of car wrecks last year. It's just unbelievable the way this has come so quickly.
5 years from today, or 50 years from today, what will this machine look like, and what will we know that we don't know today?
So 5 years from today, probably these kinds of machines will not be used much anymore, because it will be so cheap to just sequence the entire genome for maybe $100 that you wouldn't bother to get sort of subsets of the information. Just do the whole thing, and it'll be cheap and accurate. And the information 5 years from now, I think more and more people will have had this done. Their genome will be in their medical record. When they need a drug for some particular condition, the doc will look at their particular DNA and say, oh, is this the right dose for this person? Or is it even the right drug for this person? That whole idea of correlating drug response with genetics is a field that's ripe for exploration. In 5 years, we'll see a lot of that. 50 years from now, I suspect most babies will have their genome sequenced at the time of birth. And that will be a way in which it can be planned, how to make sure that they get the best possible kind of nutrition and medical care that they need. And we will have used the information to prevent an awful lot of diseases. I hope Alzheimer's disease will be something you read about in a history book at that point, and that cancer will be a rarity. That's not out of the question. We're on that path.
Well, recently there's been discussion about designer babies. Is that a dangerous thing or not?
Well, with this ability to do gene editing, people are particularly talking about this. I'm uneasy about the idea that we are smart enough to actually manipulate our future children in this way. And most of the things that people talk about wanting to manipulate, like intelligence or athletic ability, are controlled by hundreds of different genes, and the ability to actually do this accurately is not going to be very reliable. Plus, a lot of it's environment, it's child rearing. I often imagine this sort of yuppie couple that decides they want to have their designer baby, and so they dial in all the things that they think is going to make this kid a musician and the first chair in the orchestra and going to be a quarterback on the football team, and they forget to do the child rearing. And so instead they end up with a sullen 16-year-old who's smoking pot in his bedroom and never comes out, because you got to do that part too.
How did you transform yourself from being either an atheist or agnostic to somebody who's a committed Christian?
I realized that I was a scientist. I was supposed to make decisions about really important questions based on evidence, and I'd never really considered whether there might be evidence supporting the idea that there really is a God. But oh my gosh, there's an incredibly compelling, intellectual, rational basis for faith, which I had totally missed and assumed didn't exist.
You also are a motorcycle enthusiast.
I am.
Now, is that safe?
No, it's not.
But as somebody who cares about your health, how do you justify that?
Well, yes, that has been a question asked regularly.
I'm not the first person that pointed it out.
No, my mom started this. So yeah, I became a motorcycle rider in college because it was a cheap way to get around. I stopped riding motorcycles when my kids were little because I did recognize the safety issues.
So you don't do it anymore?
I do. I started again. It is a wonderful sort of
You do it still?
I do. I ride my motorcycle to work many days. It's a Harley Road King Classic. It's a beast, and it gives you a certain sense of enjoyment of life that's hard to come by other ways.
Let's talk about another part of your life. When you were younger, you were, if not an atheist, an agnostic. Mm-hmm. How did you transform yourself from being either an atheist or agnostic to somebody who's a committed Christian?
It does seem like an odd story, doesn't it? Well, growing up on the farm, my parents were not opposed to religion. They just didn't think it was particularly relevant. So I had no religious background. Got to college, you know, those conversations in the dorm about what do people believe, and I didn't think I believed in any of it. So I was an agnostic, but by the time I got to graduate school, I was shifting even more to being an atheist, and I would not be too comfortable keeping quiet if somebody was talking about the supernatural, because it was all about, you know, nature and how you study it and how you describe it. And then I went to medical school. And that third year of medical school, where you're thrust out onto the wards and you're sitting at the bedside of wonderful people whose lives are under threat and many of whom are not going to survive. And you really start to realize that your own thinking about life and death has been pretty unsophisticated compared to the reality of what these people are facing. And I realized that I was a scientist. I was supposed to make decisions about really important questions based on evidence, and I'd never really considered whether there might be evidence supporting the idea that there really is a God. I just assumed the answer was no. And that was a bit unsettling, but it seemed like something that I shouldn't ignore. So I began sort of asking those people I knew who were believers, how can you do this without checking your brain at the church door? Because isn't this just a perfect example of irrationality? And they told me, well, actually, no, there's a pretty profound rational basis for faith. You might try reading C.S. Lewis for starters. I'd never really heard much about C.S. Lewis. But picking up some of the things he'd written, particularly Mere Christianity, made it clear to me, oh my gosh, there's an incredibly compelling, intellectual, rational basis for faith, which I had totally missed and assumed didn't exist. It took me a couple of years of fighting against that, trying to prove that this was all wrong and that I could stick with my agnosticism. But ultimately, I realized I couldn't, that it was so compelling. And then I had to figure out, okay, which of the ways of understanding God is going to be the one that I can make the most sense out of. And after many considerations of various faith traditions, ultimately the person of Jesus appealed to me in a remarkable way as a historical figure, not a myth, who had answers to questions that I really needed answers for, and whose life and death and resurrection seemed to be remarkably well documented.
So your view would be, for example, what's in the Bible is allegorical. It's not to be taken as absolute fact. In other words, the Bible would say that maybe the earth is a couple thousand years old. Scientists would say it's, much older, 5 billion years old. How do you reconcile those two different strands of thought?
And it is the case that a lot of people now are tripped up by what they interpret as a conflict between a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2 and what science teaches us very convincingly about the age of the universe, almost 14 billion years, and the age of the earth, almost 5 billion years. But you know what? That idea that there's a conflict is a fairly recent arrival on the scene. Go back and read St. Augustine in 400 AD, who was obsessed with trying to figure out what is Genesis really telling us about origins. He would have been the first to say that this literal interpretation of 24-hour days is absolutely unjustified based upon the original language and the way in which the audience for the original Genesis 1 and 2 stories would have interpreted it. And somehow we, particularly in the United States, over the course of the last 150 years, have taken something that clearly was written in a way that had a lot of ambiguity and insisted that it had just one possible interpretation. So yeah, I wrote a book about a lot of this sort of perceived conflict, because for me, there really has never been one between what I know as a scientist, where if you're going to ask me a question about nature, science is going to be the way to get the answer, but also somebody who's interested in questions that science can't answer, like is there a God and why am I here?
So today, what kind of recommendation would you make to young people about what they should do with their careers? And have you ever thought, given your brain power, that you could have gone into the private sector and made a great deal of money?
Well, it really comes down to what is it that we all hope to do in that brief time that we're here on this planet? What is it that we're going to assess our contribution by? And right now, I would say medical research is very much near the top of the list of opportunities that people have, because it is such an exciting time. We are making progress at a pace now that would be unimaginable a few decades ago, and that's going to continue. So if you want to spend your time, working hard, but feeling as if you made a contribution to help people who are suffering, this is a great way to do it. And money alone is probably not going to give you that same satisfaction.